Okay, so today's presentation is CSS Fundamentals. When we choose our topics, we always kind of struggle to find a topic that is going to apply to many people. This would be one of them. So we're just kind of curious to begin with, just a raise of hands. If you had to rate your own CSS skills, where 1 is just kind of maybe beginner or you struggle, 2 intermediate, 3 you feel like you're very experienced and you have it mastered. So number 1, beginning, kind of struggling. 2 intermediate, 3 experienced. Cool, awesome. It seemed like a pretty even distribution there. Try to make it interesting even for people who have done this quite a bit. There's probably some fundamentals there, some gaps that maybe you didn't pick up along the way that hopefully we can shed light there, but everyone else, I'd say a lot of the beginning part is particularly for you. So let's get started. So we'll start super basic just in case. Not a lot of time talking about what CSS is. It's a language for specifying how web documents are presented to the user, right? I think probably most people will have that level, I assume. Otherwise, you just really like donuts. So on the traditional web, like as it started off, we really talked about documents and a browser, right? It's software used to consume the web. There's a document. A document is just a structured text file that's parsed by the browser. Most common case is HTML, but there's also XML and SVG. Both of those, all 3 of those, you can use CSS with. And then your style sheet. This is what we're talking about today. It tells the browser how to present the document to the user. Okay? This is really about people presentation. So high-level overview of how the process works. You have your browser. Your browser gets a document somehow, typically a URL, but it doesn't have to be. Your browser loads the HTML. It starts by parsing it. It finds any CSS references in there, and in parallel, it starts to parse the CSS as well. And at some point, the 2 merge to kind of create this DOM tree. And from that, you get what you see on the screen. Questions, comments, make sense? Good? Yeah? Okay. So just quickly, the DOM is a tree-like structure where every element, attribute, and text become a node in this tree. This is what your browser interacts with, right? So the browser converts HTML and CSS into the DOM. And it's a representation of that document in memory. This is what allows you to get access to parts and to manipulate and all that kind of stuff. It's a model of that document now. And it combines the content and its style, okay? And the style display is determine the display. So for instance, you write something like this. This is a paragraph. Nested, there's some text, some spans. Those spans have text. The browser parses it into something like this, where every individual part is identified. And what you end up with is kind of this conceptual tree structure like this. So that little bit of HTML creates this tree, where you have your document. The first node of that is a paragraph. That's got 4 children, a text, and 3 spans, and each of those 3 spans have text things themselves, right? We good? We not good? You guys awake? Yes? All right. So what CSS lets you do is it lets you select specific nodes within that tree and style them, right? And in this particular case, we're selecting the 3 spans of this tree, and we're giving it a background color of orange. Or, I'm sorry, yeah, background of orange. Does that make sense? Yeah? So, same idea. We have this tree. We do this thing. Our results are down here. This is very, very fundamental, right? Please feel free to interrupt with questions. All right, so that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about vocabulary, some of the basics of CSS. Here's a snippet of CSS right here. Anyone want to tell me what this is called? What? Selector. What about this? Okay, this. Can you see my mouse?
No.
Barely. How about the 2 of them together combined? Close. And then there's one more thing here. This whole entire set right here is actually the rule. So selector, property, value, declaration, rule. Good? Questions? So we take that whole thing and now we have a rule. That's an instance of a rule. In CSS, we also have at rules. Okay? Your at rules are basically some statement. It's another statement that has some special meaning. The format is a little bit different, but these are your basic building blocks of a style sheet, right? And these can nest. You can nest an at rule with these other ones. All three of these are examples of statements. So we have selectors, properties, values, declarations, rules, at rules, and statements. All those three combined into a single other file that you save off as a CSS file. That whole thing is your style sheet. Okay? So those are the fundamental vocabulary languages here. Anyone have any questions, comments about that? So, trivia here. How many CSS properties do you think there are?
The vendor specific one?
No, not by specification. How many?
300.
Who said that? Pretty good. Yep, about a little more than 300. Yep. So how many style sheets can one document contain?
Unlimited.
I don't even know if there's a limit. How many should one contain?
There's a limit.
How many?
I don't think there's a number necessarily, but
Ideally.
one.
Why?
Use requests.
Page load time.
Page load requests. What's significant about the request part?
Particularly on mobile, it's noticeable. You have a lot of requests.
Yeah. On all browsers, regardless, there's a bottleneck on the number of simultaneous requests that can happen. So that's why. So yep, 300, it's practically unlimited, and do as few as possible. Okay. So in CSS, you have your properties, your values, and your units. Right? Unfortunately, this is the part of CSS that really it requires memorization. It's not super structured. There's not really a system that can help you. Like there's 300 properties. They affect different things. This is the part of CSS that just requires some cycles. You're just going to have to write it to start learning these things. Same with the units. There's different types of units, but there are a number of them. And of course, you can have an infinite number of possible values. So when we're talking about properties, values, and units, that's the part of CSS that does require some experience and some memorization. That's not something I can stand up here and successfully teach, honestly. You want to know these things, MDN is the place you want to go. Okay? So just a quick look at syntax. So we talked a little bit about the terms. We have a property and a value. So colon always separates these two things, right? When we combine multiple of these statements, right, we end up with a declaration block. Or multiple of these declarations, sorry. You end up with a declaration block. Each declaration needs to be separated by a semicolon. Yeah? The final statement in there is optional, but recommended just because very rarely do you actually create a rule once and never visit that style again. You're always kind of tweaking. Just leave it there and save yourself future work. And we have our declaration block. Here we have a group of selectors, and the important part of the syntax is that they're comma separated. Okay, so that's how you select multiple things at the same time. White space. Tell me about white space in CSS. Doesn't really matter, right? Spaces, tabs, new lines. They're really there just so people can read them. The browser it tends to ignore much of it, and basically these two rules down here, these statements are the same. They're no difference. Comments. Only one way to comment in CSS is that. So shorthand properties. This is when you have a group of related properties and you don't want to have to go through every single one. There are some special properties in there that are just for dealing with that thing in a single declaration. Like padding. You could do this or you could do that, right? So bottom is typically preferred if you're setting more than one. Same with background. So this one right here, if those aren't familiar, it's always clockwise, starting from the top. Background one isn't as logical, unfortunately. That's the longhand. there's a shorthand variant as well. Okay, so these shorthand properties, they basically let you just in bulk set a bunch of them. And there's a number of them: font, background, border margin, flex, flex flow, probably some others as well. Okay. All right, let's talk about selectors. Now this is kind of, we're going to get a little meatier here. Okay. So we know a document is a tree structure with nodes. We talked about that. And a selector is basically just a declarative description that describes which nodes in the tree we want to select so that we can style them. That hopefully made sense. Yes? Okay. So there's basically 4 categories of selectors. We'll talk about those. You have simple, attribute, pseudo, and combinators. Okay? So the simple selectors are kind of the easiest to understand. They're just simple things. They match elements based on their type, their class, or their ID. So here is an example of a type or an element selector where you have a document with a paragraph and a div, right? And if you want to select just the paragraph, that's it. Just the letter P. Same with div. Just you write out div. That's going to select all elements, okay, that are divs and Ps. Thank you. Okay. So now we get a little more specific, and we don't want all elements. We just want a class of them. Now we have class selectors, right? In your document, this is basically marked up by the keyword, the attribute class. So we have a list here with 3 items. First item is first and done, second done, and then third. Okay. So the dot first should match which one? The first? What about done? What does that one match? Right. So the syntax distinction here is the dot beforehand, right? That's an indicator to CSS that we're talking about CSS classes now. It's a class selector. All right, now let's talk about ID selectors. This is really when you want to narrow in on one specific thing, right?
That would be a pound.
What was that?
Pound.
Good. Pound, right? Pound polite is just going to grab that one thing, and that pound rude is going to grab that other one. It's meant to select one thing.
And that's because the HTML document requires one.
Well, requires is a loose word. But yes, you should only have in your document, all your IDs should be unique in a document. That gets harder to do at scale. And generally, I would avoid using class or ID selectors. So the last simple selector we have is this universal selector, which just selects everything, right? That'll select everything in the document, every element. All right, attribute selectors. This is when we want to match elements based on their attributes and the values contained in those attributes, okay? So, what are the attributes in this document? Who can point them out? Anyone?
QTY, data is number, and timestamp.
Yep. So data QTY, data is number, timestamp. All those are attribute names. Each of them have an optional value associated with them. When you have a document structured this way, you can select elements in CSS based on the attributes there. So attribute name, attribute value, and we can select based on that combination. All right. So here are the selectors. There's actually quite a few of them here. This one is just whether or not something has an attribute. Doesn't care what the value is, or even if it has a value. If the element has an attribute, you can select it, right? Stop me if you have questions or comments. Here's one that will match all elements with that attribute, but only if the value is exactly what you specify. Okay? So if you need a very specific thing based on a data, based on this attribute value combination, you can get it. Who can explain that one? I put it in like common language.
Whenever it's not equal to the value that you specified.
It's almost like a contain. It's similar to a contain, but it's a very specific type of contain. There's 2 contain selectors in this, and this is a very specific type.
It's like a contains word, kind of.
So if it contains that value, it has a list of the values. So you can have multiple values for that one attribute, and then if it has that one value in any of them.
Exactly. So a most common use case is even in your like if it was a class, you have a space separated list of classes. I mean, you could do this with a class selector too, but if you want to select things based on whether or not one of those things is this value, this is how you do it. Okay. So it's one of those unique things in the list has to match. It's not a substring. It has to be an exact match of a list.
Is that second one order specific?
Attribute value, I think it assumes it's going to have to be exactly like no order. So if we're talking an attribute with spaces, right? I think the value there actually has to be that with the space. Okay, now we have the ability to not only just do it based on entire values, but substrings, okay? So this is a weird one. This really has like one use case, honestly, and it's for handling language codes. It's either it exactly has to be val, right? Or it has to start with val dash. Who's used this before? Me neither. Yeah, not a big use case. Who's used this before? Okay. So when an element starts with a value, right? Just like a start looks like a regular expression pattern a little bit, right? And on the flip side, the end, if it ends with that. Who's used this before? What's a common use case for that?
Numbers.
What's that?
IQ numbers. Something dash icon.
Icon. You can do it by sometimes extension of a file or a link, right? Or to maybe create a little icon or something, indicate a type. What about this one? Who's used this? It's very similar, except for this doesn't treat spaces in your document as individual items. You basically are matching against those. This order does matter, right? Like it just sees it as a string. And so you can match a subset of that string to select an element. All right, so let's do some tests here. Yeah?
When was this introduced to CSS?
It's been there a while. Anyone know? Not recently. Yeah, it's been a while. All right, so what does this one match? Can you guys see the code okay?
Yep.
First has the database. Anything with database.
So first, second, third, fourth, not 5, not 6, but 7 and 8, right?
Yep.
Okay. What about that one? Okay, last two. How about this one? What does that one mean? Do you remember?
Red pepper.
So I heard a red pepper right here.
Yeah, maybe not.
So what is that? What does that tilde one represent? You guys remember? It's just a list, space separated.
So it would be red pepper.
Red pepper. How about that one?
Is that the weird one?
So we're looking at anything in the document that has either FR or starts with FR dash as a lang.
So it'd be I.
It's just this I up here, right? Promise you'll never use that ever. How about this?
Dark.
Still gonna match that.
So this is a bulk contains. It treats the string, spaces or not, just as a single thing. So basically in there we need a string that has not spicy, and that is basically this one, right? Okay. How about that? chicken, right? Guys following? Yep, tomatoes and chicken. You guys are following. How about this one?
Starts with optional.
See anything in there?
Bacon bits olive oil. I don't think bacon bits should be optional.
It's true.
Bacon bits and olive oil.
That's a typo, but.
Yeah, sorry. Bad code demo.
Not space option.
There's no tilde in there, so it won't match either of those, will it?
It starts with optional.
It's a carrot.
So I think both of these actually.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. All right, we're going to get to some all right, pseudo-classes. Remember, we're talking about the 3 categories of selectors. 4? Did I say 3 or 4 at the beginning? I think 4. We'll find out. Okay. These are the kind of selectors. They don't actually select elements, but either they select elements when in a particular state or part of an element. Okay? So we'll break those 2 things down. So pseudo-classes. So typically, you're going to see this in a CSS file. It's a keyword preceded by a colon, right? You typically add it to the end of some other type of selector. And what that basically does is let you select that element, but when that element is in a particular state. Okay? Here's a very common use case with links. We have a link, we want to give it a color blue. A link can have different states: visited, hover, active, focus, right? Maybe some others. But these are very common where you do this. You want to style it based on the state of that link. So it's this format right here: visited, hover, active, focus. Does that make sense? All of them are selecting anchor elements, but only the things below that only when they're in a particular state. All right. Here's a long list of pseudo-classes. So at the very beginning, the people that raised their hand that said they have a lot of experience and they feel very comfortable, raise your hands again real quick. I want to go through this list and then put your hand down if you've never used one of these. Okay? Active. Any. Checked. Dir. Hands went down. Disabled. Still down. Empty. Still down. First. First child. Yeah, re-raise. Sorry. I'm just curious, yeah.
Like an X word.
Which ones are, yeah, exactly. Come back up every time if you've done it. First child. First of type. Full screen. 1 person, 2 people. Focus. Hover. Indeterminate. Lies. In range. Invalid. Lang. Last child. Last of type. Left. Link. Come on. Not. Nth child. Nth last child. Nth last of type. Only child. Only of type. Optional. Out of range. Read only. Read write. Required. Right. Root. Scope. Target. Valid. Visited. All right. I just had to show there's a range. You don't have to have all these memorized. Some of these, like, you very seldomly will even have to think about or know about. The same rules kind of apply here. This is something that you probably just need to have some experience with. Read the reference there. It's not something, we're not going to teach what each one means. That would take forever and it would be really, really boring. But just do know you don't have to know all of them. But there are some that are very commonly used. Okay? All right, pseudo elements. Who knows what those are and the distinction? Who wants to answer the question? What are they? What's the distinction?
It's an actual element that's based on the page, but it's not one that you
code in HTML, it's just there because.
It's like CSS kind of makes it a thing. Is that a good way of just? It's not really an element in the document.
It's not, yeah, it's not a normal tag, but it's treated like an element. And it's inserted there when you have styles present.
Yeah. So their keywords, again, preceded by 2 colons this time. And you also typically add them to the end of a selector. They select just typically a certain part of an already element. So and what's happening here? Who wants to tell me what's happening here? Over here.
So that arrow is being added to any link where the href attribute starts with HTTP
Where is it being added?
at the end of.
Yeah. So we said that little arrow is being added to every link. We're added after the link, where every href attribute on that starts with HTTP, right?
So you're indicating on your page where your links go external?
So, yep. So if you want to see a code pin down here, if you can see it. In the markup, you'll look, we don't actually have those arrows, right? But in CSS, by doing this, we're actually creating content. And this is meant to indicate that, hey, you're going to this is a external link, right? Because it's not a relative path is essentially the logic they're trying here. Question back here?
I have a question, just a comment.
Okay.
Saying after and before, which is a sibling, are misleading. They are not outside of the element. It's the first or the last inside of the element, just to clarify.
Okay. The double after? Or the double colon after?
Yeah, it's inside of the link still. It's just after everything.
After the content box, is that what you mean?
Well, meaning in this case, the arrow is also highlighted.
So yeah, it would feel like
Or
after the
still,
content
the
of,
arrow
yeah.
is the arrow
So think about
from the
your anchor is a box. It appends it after the content in the box, if that makes sense.
It's still within the box.
It's still within the box, correct. That was misleading. Thank you for calling that out. Here are a list of pseudo elements. I think everyone would raise their hand at that same thing on after and before. Yeah? What about first line? Anyone's used that? And first letter?
First letter there.
Selection? What does that do? You guys know?
It's for highlighting text.
What would you typically style?
Do you want to change the color of the highlight, for example?
Yeah.
There's only a few properties that you can use with that.
And then backdrop. Anyone ever heard of that? Me neither. One day. All right, the fourth category of selectors are combinators. And this is when you are combining selectors, you're basically performing a more fine-grained selection. Okay.
Since you have a Schwarzenegger accent.
I don't even have one, sorry. You want to come up and do it? Combinatus. There. Okay. Quickly, A, B squished together, no space, no characters, touching, means they have to match both A and B at the same time, right? A and B with the space separating them means it matches B, but only if B is a descendant, no matter how deep, of A.
So
Okay.
using B's or other selectors.
So basically we're selecting B, the final thing is what we're selecting, but only in the context of somewhere up in its ancestry there's an A.
So white space or spaces that matter in
White space right here matters. Yeah, totally. So A and B separated by the greater than is B a direct child of A, right? A plus B means they're siblings, but B has to be the next sibling. Okay? A squiggly B means they're sibling, but among the next, let's see, matching B, that is among the next sibling of an element. So not directly next, but somewhere after as a sibling.
So, curious, if this can be done, but so under combinators in the top one, how do you do tags?
So you would, the combinator of the top one, an element would never have two tags, right? You can't have something be both an anchor and a list item at the same time.
But you can have a div or a
You can do a
div that's
comment.
parent of a span.
You could do
Comma separated. So it'd be A comma B, and it will match both A and B, so you could have P and LI,
Okay.
but it would be, you'd have to do a little bit more than
We did a comma separated.
That's matching both A and B. This distinction here is saying only match an element if it is both A and B. So an instance would be A dot class name. Matches anything that's has an anchor and this class. Has to be both, right? That's an example of that combination. So pop quiz. Fail and you have to give back the donuts. First one, who wants to tell me what's happening? Niels.
So it's any cell in the table as well as any table header that is the direct child of the table.
See any problems with this code? That's true.
There's no style.
That's also true.
You have no row before the table headers or column.
Correct.
Table headers are supposed to be in rows.
Yeah. So that last one wouldn't match because it's saying I'm a direct descendant of a table, and it's not semantically right. You need.
What's the table again? Can you
Yeah,
No.
I say that.
If you don't know, good. Just kidding. So the reason why the order of the tags there, you have a table, has to be table, tr, th. In this case, we're looking for a th that's a direct descendant of table, which doesn't happen, right? So who wants to talk about the second one besides Niels? Over here.
It would select any th that was a descendant of a t-head, which in turn was a descendant of table,
Correct.
which seems a little excessive.
A little
since they
excessive.
should be descendants of each other.
Right. I agree.
You should just specify th and get the same thing.
Correct. In the table's examples aren't the best,
Correct,
but they illustrate the principle that that particular selector, that th up in its ancestry, first has to have a t-head, and then above that has to be a table, right? In that order. What about the next one? Who's got it? Yep.
To select every TD except for the first TD in a sequence of TDs that is the child of T-body, or descendant of T-body and table.
Yep. So working backwards,
So everything except for the first one in the sequence of TDs.
we're going to match a TD. When that TD follows another TD, right, is essentially what that's saying, as far as siblings, where they are descendants of T-body, and that T-body is a descendant of table. Yeah? Okay. Who wants to do this one? So this is going to match
Last TD in the table.
every last TD doesn't mean just one.
Right.
So a table can have multiple rows, right?
Or there could be multiple tables. The sequence of
Yep. It's going to span across multiple tables. And we're selecting all TDs that are the last thing in a row in the entire document, essentially. As long as it's a descendant of a T-body and that T-body is a descendant of a table.
So if there's only one TD in each row.
That's the last one. Yep. Okay, who wants to do this one? Blake.
It creates a pseudo element after the last child, the last TD in a row, that is a descendant of something that has a class with currency and the attribute that's equal, length equal to FR.
Good. So we have a class selector at the root somewhere with currency that has to have a language attribute where language equals FR. That has to exist in the document, right? And then from there, anything that has a TD that is the last child of something, doesn't matter what, right? We're going to select the space after the content within there and add some stuff. Yep.
So if you're FR dash FR, you're not going to do this.
FR dash FR. If we're using that language code correctly, this isn't going to match. We're going to have to use that weird pipe one, right?
Right.
Okay. And the last one. This is answers. Someone over here asked a question earlier about the AB connected one. Here's an example of something that has to have two classes, both of these classes. If it's a dot thumbnail, if it has a class thumbnail, and it has a class isBig, right? We're going to look for any element that has both of those classes, and we're going to make it bigger by 2. Yeah? Good?
Order matter on that?
Nope.
If it was his big.
Doesn't matter if it's tag.
Yeah, correct. Okay, are we good?
Tag is after.
Because now we're going to talk about fun stuff, fish. All right. A cascade. Who's familiar with this term and what it means? The C in CSS, right? So in CSS, we're basically, if you look at the selectors and all the different ways that you can basically select something, what you have with CSS is multiple inheritance, and at some point in time, there's going to be conflict, right? And how do we resolve conflicts? So notice it says property conflict resolution and not rule. So the distinction is multiple rules don't necessarily conflict, right? Only if both rules contain this conflicting statements. If both of them are basically trying to adjust the color property, that's when we're talking resolution. Otherwise, it just merges. Okay? So we got that distinction, okay? Okay.
Last one wins.
If only.
All things are equal.
That's, yep. All right. So here we have a paragraph, and in our paragraph we have 3 spans. Each span has some text. They all also have classes. One of them has an ID, right? And we get the style sheet. Usually maybe we've acquired a style sheet and we've gone through 1,000 lines of code and we've narrowed down to these like 5 rules that are potentially conflicting. We've got to figure out why. All right? And we want to know based on this, what color is that? How do we know?
Blue.
Who thinks it's purple? Don't be scared. Who thinks it's blue? Who thinks it's red? Who thinks it's yellow? Orange? Who didn't raise their hand? Chickens. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about, conflict resolution. So when you're trying to figure out what wins, right, you have this weighted system is used to determine that. And it's based on 3 factors. And I hate like source order, the hardest word in the English dictionary to pronounce, and importance. Okay? Specificity. All right. So note, this is from least important to most important. Okay? So source order is the least important, then specificity, then importance. Okay?
1, 2, and 3.
Yep. Yep. So source order, nailed the comment. When everything else is equal, that's when. That's when source order matters. So the participation trophy goes to that bottom one. Okay? That makes sense? Everything else there is equal. So the importance there is equal. The specificity is equal. Okay? All right, this is the very complex part. Okay? It's a measure of how specific a selector is in terms of how many elements it could match. Okay? That's kind of the idea behind it. The more specific a selector, the fewer items it will match, the more weight that rule has. Okay? The amount of specificity a selector has is based on something called selector weight, which is kind of, there's a system here. And we can think about it this way. It has 4 different values, which can be thought of as thousands, hundreds, tens, and ones, although they don't round. Okay? So you can never have so many ones that we eventually get to tens, but think of them as kind of major categories. Okay? It's a base infinity system with 4 columns. Yeah, someone over here.
Does selector weight differ based on browser?
No, shouldn't, or they're doing it wrong.
They all follow, so they all follow pretty close.
Yes, modern day browsers, I can't think of any case where they differ anymore at all. So for instance, down below in this system, right, the one on the left has a higher specificity than the one on the right. Even if we added one more thing to make the thing on the right higher, that became like whatever, it doesn't matter. The presence of something on the column further left makes it bigger, no matter how big anything else on the right is. Okay? Does that make sense? So let's break down this selector weight. So in that thousands, the far left, the most important part, the thing with that's going to win out no matter what. If it's a 1, if the declaration is contained within a style tag in your document or as part of a style attribute. Okay? So in your document, you can refer to a style sheet with a link, external, or inline with a style. If you have conflicting rules, the style tag wins every time. There is no way for the other thing to become more important. Well, there is. There's no way for the specificity to become greater. Okay? Remember, this specificity. Number 2 is there's something even more powerful than this, right? That can actually just blow all this away.
And style attribute beats the style tag.
Oh, good to know. Style attribute beats style tag when there's conflict. Which kind of, well, that kind of makes sense because source order. Maybe. I don't know. Interesting. Okay, anyway. The hundreds place, right? You get 1 point for every ID selector contained within the overall selector. Okay? So if you kind of read between the lines there, anything that isn't in a style, that isn't an ID, that is a selector, cannot ever beat an ID selector. Does that make sense? Like, think about the things we've talked about that can beat this right now. So the tens place holds your class selectors, your attribute selectors, your pseudo-class contained in there. For every one of those in your overall selector, that's a point. So it doesn't matter how many class selectors you append on a particular thing, you can never beat out an ID selector, ever. That's why I just don't use them. Like it's a nuclear option. Okay? Sometimes you don't have a choice, so never is relative. Ones. For each element selector, so tag name, or pseudo element contained in the overall selector. So no matter how many there you have, like how specifically you define the path to something, you can never beat out a selector with even just one class selector in its entire thing. Does that make sense? And then the universal selector, the combinators, whether it's a sibling or a child, and also the pseudo-class not, they have no effect whatsoever on specificity. Okay? Good? So let's take a look at some things, right? So here's an H1. Has no classes, no IDs. It's defined in just an external style sheet. Its specificity is 0001. Make sense? The next one, important, with the ID, has a specificity of 100. Okay? Which beats out almost all other things but the last one on the page, right? If you look at them. The next one, when we're talking, we have an element selector, followed by an element with an attribute, followed by a class, right? We have 2 in the ones, 2 in the tens, giving it that. That would be more important than the H1 and the one right before it. And then finally, this is something inside of a style element. It gets 1 in that thousandths place, and then those compete with each other potentially based on the hundreds, tens, and ones. And so it gets 1,113 in a non-base 10 system. Good? Does this make sense to everyone? It's kind of hard to memorize, but I don't want to. Hey, there's a calculator, right? So here's an online resource you click on, you can put in, I'll just do one real quick, just to show. Right down here, let's just do .class, right? And no matter how many span, I'm never going to beat out that one below, right? One has 11, one has 10. Obviously 10's higher than 11.
So probably the proper way to speak about them is to say it's 0010, not 10.
Yeah. If you have a selector, if any one of these ever gets to like 9 or 10, you probably have problems. Yeah.
I'm sure I would have inherited.
Personally?
Yes. All right. Okay. And again, if you're having specificity battles, that should be a smell that something's wrong, honestly. Like it's not going to end well for you or the next person. Or you if the next person knows where you live. Okay. At that point in time, you want to maybe consider adopting a strategy or a system. There are a number of things out there. We'll talk about that at the end maybe. That should brief things, ways of organizing CSS essentially. And finally, the last thing in the resolution list is this important thing, right? Don't use it. Ever. Unless you have to.
Unless it's important then.
So use case, honestly, is usually it's because you have no control over the entire code base, like a CMS. They've done some really gross things, and you have to be even grosser to beat them. That's basically what it boils down to. So don't do it. FYI, when you have competing things in there, then I think source order is what determines who wins. I don't know if specificity does or not. Just don't do it. It's not worth knowing. Okay. So just to recap, source order, specificity, importance, right? Those are the high-level categories. Specificity is a very complex system. If we were to take that and break it down into this resolution system, who can fill out this chart for me? What would be, out of all three of those things, what would be the 100,000s place? Important. What about next? Style. What about next?
IDs.
What was that?
IDs.
ID selectors. Next? Class, pseudo-class, attribute selectors. Then?
Selectors.
Element, pseudo selectors, right? Just the basic tags. And then what? Source order. Good? Okay. Inheritance. I'm going to go really fast now. There's only like 2 slides. Hey, some are inherited, some aren't. You're welcome. Seriously, that's it. You look at what they say. How do you figure out which ones?
MDN.
Common sense is what it says. Right. MDN. Okay. Things that make sense. Font, right? Font, colors, those kind of things inherit. Padding wouldn't make sense to inherit all the way down. You have a, right? Okay. You can control how things inherit. There's kind of 3 properties to do it. Inherit, initial, unset. Inherit will say, give me whatever my parent has. Initial will reset it to whatever its default thing is in the browser style sheet. And unset just kind of unsets the inheritance if you've previously tweaked it. Who's used unset before?
I'm not, but that seems useful.
A couple people? Yeah.
ID11 doesn't support it.
Interesting.
Still seems useful.
Screw it.
All right, box model. Who's familiar with this term? Good. It's the foundation of layout on the web. Okay. Each element on your document visually ends up being represented by a rectangular box. Okay. The box, each box's content, padding, border, margin surrounds another box, and then another box, right? You end up with this big giant onion is what they call it, right? Like this layer and layer upon these things happening over and over and over again. Okay. And as the browser renders, it goes through all those things, determine how big something should be, positioning with other elements, all that kind of stuff. And there's basically these fundamental parts to the box model. Okay. You have your width and height. By default, that only sets, who's frustrated with this in the past? Only that inside part, right? Because in the past, there's a property now where you can tweak this. In the past, you always had to do math between width, height, padding, border, and then to figure out what your actual width was of the whole entire thing, okay? But width and height is talking about that content box, okay? That's where your text content and other boxes are. Then you have padding around that. That's between your content and your border. Then your border, then your margin. Your margin kind of determines the relationship with neighbors, okay? Everyone kind of familiar with this idea? Okay. There are different types of boxes, and you can change the behavior. This is the display property that lets you kind of change the different box types, okay? Most commonly that is block, inline, sometimes inline block and flex. There's also like table. There's a number of them, but really like block, inline, flex, I would say are most common. Inline block, a little less common, but also You'll see it. So here's the must-do I was talking about. You can convert everything from width and height being your content to it being all the way to the borders. Okay? Make your math a lot easier. Just put this at the top of your style sheet and just you're much happier. Okay? All right, challenges. Who wants to talk about challenges in CSS? Anyone? What's common challenges?
Having to fight with other people's CSS.
Integrating with other people's CSS? What else? Yeah, right here.
You mentioned that it's no longer a problem. It used to be that every browser displayed something different.
Yeah, there's still a little bit of that. Yeah, not as bad.
Cleaning up CSS because it grows and grows and grows.
Scaling.
Stuff out, it's huge.
Scaling CSS. Anyone like scaling CSS? Anything else? IE. Okay. Anything else?
Finding unused rules.
Unused rules like bloat. Feeling safe to even remove things because you don't even know what it affects, kind of thing. Very common. All right. Well, it's hard. First, you have to memorize a lot of things. You have to know what's possible, right? That takes some experience in knowing stuff. It's hard to scale. We talked about that. Managing globals, this cascade, the specificity wars, and acquiring other people's code is always the worst thing in the world. Okay. So how do you level up on some of those? Honestly, like the bulk of that, anything that memorization stuff, just write more. You're not going to get properties. You're not going to get that until you just write it. There's nothing besides writing that you can do to help you there. Now the scaling aspect, that's a little bit different. There are some strategies that you can take, right? So that cascade and that inheritance model, they're awesome until they're not, right? Like we want that and then we don't. We want to selectively take to advantage that cascade model. But there are times we want to limit it, okay? And there's a number of strategies you can take. We had at Donuts before about atomic design that kind of touched on some strategy on that. There's something out there called ITCSS. It's inverted triangle. All these are kind of strategies for dealing with scaling, okay? CSS modules let you scope things more. Same with BEM. Those two are kind of similar. One's conventional, one's technology. Let's take a look at just the philosophy behind ITCSS real quick, because you're going to find that a lot of these philosophies are very similar, right? The implementation may differ a little bit, but the philosophy is the same. So in here, they're talking about an inverted triangle, about how you create your CSS. And they define it like settings, tools, generics, elements, objects, components, and trumps, okay? Settings should be like your variables, your definitions, etc. Really, really low-level stuff. They should output no CSS, okay? Your tools, they're very similar to the settings. These are functions and mixins, depending on what language you're in, that kind of thing. Either way, both of these things, they do not output CSS, right? Now we start to get into our generics. These are your resets or your normalizations. Who's familiar with a normalize.css or reset.css? Similar ideas. All it does is it tries to make consistent the default style from browser to browser to browser. Every project should have some variance of this, or otherwise you're going to be having weird spacing issues potentially. So it just normalizes the default style from browser to browser to browser. That's the idea. It could be very, very unopinionated about that, which is a reset, to something that's more of a logical default style. That's kind of the more normalization approach. Okay? Okay, then you have your elements, which these are kind of the base styles for unclassed. This is specific to maybe your project, where everything above that would be not necessarily specific to a project, right? Like resetting tools, those kind of things. There's maybe potential a lot of reuse between them. Objects is when you start to add classes to things, and you're starting to get more specific. Like maybe there's different types of H1s that you want to style account for, right? These are still like the elements was just the tag period. This is kind of the foundation for which the objects will build from. Then the objects are that build up from that default style. And then your components, that's when you're starting to group things together and how certain compositions of of objects behave, right? This is like your widget or a pattern, like a drawer or a maybe like, I don't know, something else, a common widget you're going to find on a page. That's that grouping of things. And finally, trumps, that's like your nuclear override. That's usually important. That's like just you're very, very specific. And just kind of thing to point out here, I know we're out of time. I'm almost done, I promise. The things at the top of the pyramid, they have a wider reach, right? Meaning they have the potential, or they do affect more things. So you want these to be stable. If these change, that could be problematic for the rest of the triangle. These are foundational things, right? So they have a bigger reach, they're less specific, right? And they're more general. You're not going to have very specific rules towards the top, where at the bottom these are very, very specific. Does that make sense? Additionally, the specificity increases from the top, which should be like 0, to the bottom, which is like your nuclear option, right? So basically, at every layer, you should be able to override anything at the layer above. Does that make sense? So the system you build, however you organize your code, you need to make sure you've defined some nice, clear layers that you don't ever violate, like you're always able to override the thing above you. Okay? And then the explicitness from talk, again, is just generic, low-level, unremarkable rules, right? To the very bottom where they're very, very specific use case rules. They're very explicit for a use case. Does that make sense? All those systems kind of deal with this same idea of what things inherit everything and what things you want to limit that inheritance on. Because if it's hard to manage everything if everything feels kind of global. If that makes sense. Questions, comments? The end. We good with questions? Stop the recording. Yeah, what's up?
I guess I don't think I understood the difference between specificity and what's the other side? What's this?
So one deals with the actual weight of the selector.
Okay.
The other one deals maybe with the like how opinionated your rules are, or how opinionated your statements are. So further up, you don't want to like hard code in like maybe like all things get this height or this font size, let's say. But as you go further and further down, you're going to be more explicit about those type of properties, font size. We're going to say now, the further down we go, the more specific even the rules become. So that's the difference. But the specificity too, it allows you to be able to trump the layer above.